Good evening, and welcome to an evening with David Brooks. I'm Chancellor Phil DiStefano, and I'm glad you're here for what promises to be a notable evening. I'd like to acknowledge some of our guests out there in Zoom audience. First of all, my wife Yvonne, our CU President, Mark Kennedy. We have a number of regents with us. Our Chair, Glenn Gallegos, Vice Chair, Leslie Smith, Norbert Chavez, Callie Renison, Sue Sharkey, and Elena Dubin-Spiegel. I especially want to thank the Leo Hill trustees for their support for this ongoing speaker series. The Leo Hill Speaker Series is our marquee public leadership event. It exposes our students and communities to national and global leaders and diverse viewpoints, and it gives our students opportunities to connect with leaders in a personal way. One way we believe in shaping tomorrow's leaders is by bringing accomplished leaders to campus. And that's what the Leo Hill Leadership Speaker Series is all about. To strengthen this focus, I recently established the Center for Leadership to support our campus imperatives of developing tomorrow's leaders, being a leading innovation catalyst, and impacting humanity in positive ways. The Center for Leadership and its programs aren't confined to a single college or school, but are embedded across our campus and available to all students through more than 24 programs. As you dialed into this event, you may have seen our 5 student leaders of the year: Sitlali, Alicia, Brian, Alisa, and Ali. They represent the wonderful students who embody the values of CU Boulder. We're very proud of them. And now I'd like to invite one of those students, Ali Reuter, to introduce Mr. Brooks. Ali is a 4th-year student in the President's Leadership class. She's pursuing a degree in integrative physiology with a neuroscience certificate and a minor in leadership. She is also our senior class president, serves on our Dean's Council for Ethics and Leadership, and volunteers as a student leader for Lead Colorado, mentoring high school students in the community. I welcome Ali Reuter.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Ali Reuter, and it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. David Brooks this evening. While tonight we have the privilege to learn about his most recent endeavor, Weave, the Social Fabric Project, I would like to begin by giving a bit of a background on Mr. Brooks to complete the picture of how he has gotten to where he is today. Mr. Brooks studied history at the University of Chicago, and he transitioned into police reporting shortly after graduation. He also spent time posted in Brussels, Belgium, covering the affairs of the Middle East, South Africa, and Europe. Before writing for the New York Times, Mr. Brooks was with the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as served as senior editor at the Weekly Standard for many years. He has since become an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, as well as a commentator on PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. Mr. Brooks has written 4 books, one of which, titled The Road to Character, is a #1 New York Times bestseller. As if he is not busy enough, he has also been a professor at Yale University and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2018, Mr. Brooks became executive director of a new initiative at the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C. This initiative is called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. To lay the groundwork for their broader mission, Weavers are working with diverse communities nationwide to identify weaknesses we as a society are facing. They are taking a closer look at the historical definition of successful leadership and are working to rewrite that definition to shift the focus from how can I be the best to how can we move the needle. Mr. Brooks believes that the way we can bridge the gap between the discrepancies we see in today's culture is through this new lens on leadership, where leaders prioritize connection and trust. Weave is, at its core, a cultural movement that is trying to mend the distrust and exclusion that many Americans feel. The work being done through Weave is what has brought us all here tonight. We are thrilled to have the opportunity to learn from Mr. David Brooks this evening, especially regarding a topic that is increasingly pertinent in our society. I would like to personally thank Mr. Brooks for his time and for being willing to speak to leaders across the country about how we may begin to repair the social fabric of America. Without further ado, I give you David Brooks.
Thank you, Ellie. It's a real pleasure to be here. Ellie and I and a bunch of other students and a bunch of civic leaders had a chance to have a meeting earlier today, which I thought was a fantastic meeting. What struck me about the CU students I met was first, their number one goal, which they talked about, was looking for purpose. They want to have purpose in their lives. They want to know how they can find that purpose. And they were asked, what's the number one problem in your community? And they said mental health. And so what struck me was how personal and spiritual and emotional both these things were, and moral. And so I've sort of adjusted my talk. I'm going to try to keep it brief so the chancellor and I can have a conversation, and make it a little more about these relational issues, make it a little more about personal issues. And I was trying to spew out advice I've gotten from wise people, and I think they appreciated the one I said, divide your life into chapters. The happiest people are those who say, okay, the next 3 years are a chapter in my life. And then I'll have another chapter, but I'm just going to worry about what I'm going to accomplish in this chapter. The most unhappy people in life just lead day-to-day lives and never set back and say, what's my chunk here? And I want to salute CU for the leadership program. A lot of universities don't teach moral formation. It used to be at the core of the university. There was a headmaster who once said, I try to produce students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And that's the kind of people we want in this society, not necessarily people who are just all about their resume, but people who also, as I once put it, have the eulogy virtues, the things they say about you after you're dead, are the honorable, courage, capable of great love. And so I'm going to talk a little about my life and a little about how I've been formed and what made me who I am. I grew up really in New York, and I'm formed by New York. New York pace is my pace. My joke is, if you're not living in New York, you're not really trying. I like life fast, and that has its ups and downs. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I decided I wanted to become a writer at that moment. And I've been writing every day since, except for maybe 200 in the past 50 years. There is always a moment, I call it an enunciation moment, early in life, where you discover what's truly beautiful to you. My daughter, when she was 5, she walked into an ice hockey rink, and now she teaches ice hockey in Southern California. I once read an interview with a painter, and she was asked, why do you paint? And she just said, I just love the smell of paint. There's that thing you can ask yourself, what am I doing when I feel most beautiful? And that's usually where you should be spending your time. So I found it in writing, and writing was at the center of my values. I went to high school, and I wanted to date this woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me. She wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so those were my values. And it was bookish. And I went off to a bookish university, as Ali said, the University of Chicago. My favorite saying about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. Or the other one is, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And it was a bookish place, but it really formed me because it taught me the love of reading. You could live to be 150. You're not going to have enough experiences on your own to really understand life. You have to borrow other people's experiences as they're found in books. And my professors just felt if you read these deep books carefully, you would find the keys to life. People say if somebody burns with enthusiasm, people will come for miles to watch the flames. And my professors really burned with that enthusiasm, and it had a lifelong impact on me. I did a lucky break at Chicago. I was a school columnist already doing that. And William F. Buckley came to campus, and I wrote a mean parody of him for being a name-dropping blowhard. But he apparently thought it was funny. And he said at the end of his talk, David Brooks, if you're in the audience, I want to give you a job. And so I wasn't in the audience. I was actually hired to debate Milton Friedman on PBS as a college student. You can go on YouTube, and you can look at a 22-year-old version of me with big bushy hair and these gigantic 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Mount Palomar Lunar Observatory. But I called Buckley 3 years later, and he gave me that job, and he started me in journalism. And my career has been way better than I ever thought it would be. I've had way more career success than I ever anticipated. And I found it's okay. It's not as exciting and not as satisfying as I thought it would be. When I got my first bestseller, my mood was completely flat. I'd been a lifelong dream to write a best-selling book, but it didn't really affect me that much. And it did change me a little. It made me really busy. And that had a corrosive effect on my soul because I was all about time. I always had this clock in my head. I got to get this done. I got to get that done. I pumped gas at the gas station. I got 90 seconds. I can get 2 emails done. And there's a part of us, like, we call the soul. It is a piece of us that has no size, shape, color, or weight, but gives us infinite value and dignity. And that soul yearns for goodness. I think we're all primarily motivated to be good. And I would say in the course of busyness, that was numbed over. And I was just in the routine of speed. And so I had this dark period in around 2012, 2013. And I was living alone in an apartment, and I was doing what any idiot would do. I was trying to work my way out of the problem. I figured I could just work enough. And so if you went to my kitchen drawer and pulled out where there should have been silverware, there was just Post-it notes, because all I was doing was working. And that lonely sensation manifested as sort of a burning in my stomach and an extreme loneliness. A lot of Americans experience loneliness. I was certainly experiencing then. And so it was a period of suffering. And most of us need a period of suffering to knock the ego out. There's a theologian, Paul Tillich, who said what suffering does is it interrupts your life and reminds you you're not the person you thought you were. It carves into the floor of the basement of your soul and it reveals a cavity. And it carves through the floor of that and reveals a cavity below. You just see depths of yourself that you didn't know existed. And you realize that only spiritual and emotional food will fill that. So you reorient your life. The moments of suffering knock you. And so you learn to say, okay, that's the downside of my life. What am I going to do with it after it? And so what I did, one of the things I did is I got back in the classroom as community. The classroom was my community. I had a class which was called leadership, but my kids called it therapy with Brooks, because we all just spilled our guts. And I pointed out to them, and I say this to the students now, and hopefully to people of all ages, in the course of the next 10, 15 years, you're going to make 4 big commitments in your life. And the fulfillment of your life will depend on how well you execute and choose those 4 big commitments. And the first is a commitment to a vocation, to a job. And the wrong question to ask when you're choosing a job is, what do I want to do with my life? The right question to ask is, what is life asking of me? What problems are out there that I'm uniquely suited to serve? Somebody said, a vocation, you found your vocation when your deep happiness meets the world's great need. And so the way to think about it is to look externally, not internally. Where is the big problem that I'm equipped to serve? And there's usually a sense of beauty and real fulfillment in that. The second big challenge, which most college students don't want to think about, but I really encourage them, is marriage. Most college students are 22. One of my students said, hey, marriage is a box that'll come in the mail when I'm 35. I don't need to think about it yet. I say it's the most important decision of your life. And so start planning, start preparing yourself to be good at relationships. Have relationships in college, date people. A lot of my students were too busy to date. And so they weren't developing those muscles. Then read Jane Austen and George Eliot. Read literature. It educates your emotion and teaches you to think about these big emotional experiences. Learn from the experts. A marriage is a 50-year conversation. Find someone you can talk with the rest of your life. You don't want to be like those senior citizens you see at Applebee's or Denny's who are just sitting there in silence. Go for admiration. Love comes and goes, but if you admire the person you admire, that's very stable. Go for kindness. A lot of us don't think kindness is too sexy, but kindness is the key quality in a marriage. As somebody said, more marriages fail for lack of friendship than for lack of love. And then once you get married, one of the things you realize is until you're married or until you have deep friends, you can live with the illusion that you're easy to live with. After you're married, you realize, no, I'm not that easy to live with. And after you're into the relationship, you realize, the person I'm with is kind of selfish. And as they're realizing that, then they're realizing, as you're realizing that, they're realizing that I'm kind of selfish. And then eventually in any relationship, you come to realize your own selfishness is the only problem you can actually address. So a good relationship is two people focusing on their own selfishness. The third big commitment you're going to make is to a philosophy or a faith. And my only words on that are, don't invent your own. Maybe if your name is Nietzsche, you can come up with a philosophy. In college, it's really important to learn about the moral traditions that have been handed down to us and see which one fits. And then the final commitment you're going to make is to a community, to a place, and to a neighborhood. And to me, making that kind of commitment was what really got me out of the valley. I founded Weave 2 years ago because while I was in a valley, the whole nation was in a valley. You see a rise in suicide, a rise in depression, a loss of social trust. A generation ago, if you asked people, do you trust your neighbors? 60% of Americans said, yeah, I trust my neighbors. Now it's down to 33%. And of young adults, only 19%. The younger you go, the more distrust there is. And that's because it's earned distrust. People have been betrayed. Trust is the ratio between the number of times people have come through for you versus the number of times they've betrayed you. And a lot of people have been betrayed, both personally, by their institutions, by their nation, and their society. And a distrust builds distrust. Distrusting people don't believe in experts, so they don't believe in truth. Distrusting people don't get together with their neighbors because they don't know who they can trust. Distrusting people can't do business because every business relies on a deal that the other person will follow through on their commitments. And so in my view, I'm alarmed about America because we're in a distrust doom loop. But I found people who are building trust. And these are weavers, we call them. And they're in every location. You go to anywhere and you ask people, who's trusted here? And they'll point you to the same individuals because there are certain people who just radiate trustworthiness. And they're not always the fancy people. We went into one community and we asked who's trusted here. And they all pointed us to the guy who takes the cash at the parking lot, at the big parking garage. And he's a guy who knows about City Hall, knows how the city works. So if anybody has a problem with the city or with zoning, you go to the guy in the parking garage and you know he'll come through for you. And these weavers are the ones rebuilding trust. If our society is going to come back, it's going to require leadership from the top, for sure. But mostly it's going to require trustworthy communities from the bottom. And these weavers are the people doing that. For example, there's a woman named Mary Gordon who runs an organization called Roots of Empathy. And Roots of Empathy takes kids and teaches them empathy. And the way they do it is they put an infant and a mother in the middle of the room, an 8th grade classroom, and the students surround the infant and they have to guess what's going on in the infant's head. It gets them in the habit of thinking, okay, what's going on in their head? And one day there was a kid named Darren in the class, this 8th grade class, and he was bigger than everybody else because he'd been held back. And he was kind of scary looking. And he'd been through the foster care system. He'd seen his mom get killed. And he'd had a very rough life. And he asked the mom if he could hold the baby. And the mom was a little nervous because he looked scary. But she let him and he held the baby to his chest. He was wonderful with the baby. And then he gave the baby back to the mom and he asked a bunch of questions about parenting. And one of them was, do you think you can be a good father if you've never been loved? And so what weavers do is they take guys like Darren and they embrace them in community. There's a guy, a friend of mine named Pancho Arguelles in Houston, who takes mostly Latinos who've been paralyzed in construction accidents, and he gives them wheelchairs and diapers and catheters so they can lead lives of dignity. And he turns them into social workers. So you'll be in a Houston neighborhood and you'll get 25 Latino guys wheeling in your neighborhood doing work for your community. Woman I met in South Central LA in Watts named Keisha Daniels. Keisha's grown up in Watts. She knows Watts. She's trusted in Watts. And she created something called Sisters of Watts, which is just an organization to help the kids fill their backpacks with food if they're hungry at home. She helps the homeless with bathing. She cleans up Watts. She sees other people come from outside Watts and they get the big foundation grants. They don't know Watts. They come in to watch, they're not trusted in watch, they work until the money's left out and then they leave. And that's how you construct distrust. And so what my little organization does is we lift up weavers. We want to tell their stories. We want to hand them a little money because they're not going to get it from the big foundations. We want to bring them together because a lot of these weavers are lonely. They're giving all the time, but they're not sharing. And so the emotional burdens on them are intense. And so we just want to shift the norms. You have a different norm of what is a neighbor, what is a community builder. Not my neighborhood in Washington, D.C., if I knocked on my neighbor's door at 8 p.m., it would be considered an outrageous violation of privacy. If you go to New Orleans, I said, none of us knock on our neighbors' doors. None of us really know our neighbors. And they all looked at me like I was crazy. I was like, no, we're always in each other's houses. And so we have created this epidemic of loneliness, of distrust, of problems with our relationships. And the students I met with today and the people in middle age understand that problem. And it's up to each of us to try to shift our behavior. So we don't just say we put relationships first, but we actually do put relationships first. We slow down. We reject a culture of individualism, reject a culture that says, I can make myself happy. And I would say in my time in the Valley, I haven't become like the super moral person, but I think I've become a more vulnerable person. And I think I've become someone who works on his stuff and struggles with the things that are wrong. And I hope we can become that country, because the epidemic of distrust really threatens us with national decline in a way that I've never felt before. And weavers are the people who are going to fix it. And especially the weavers at a place like CU. As I've gone around the country talking about weave, talking about community building, talking about how to build trust, two groups have really been most enthusiastic, most ahead of me. Middle-aged people going through a life transition. They're thinking, okay, I'm retiring or whatever. What do I do with the next 20 years of my life? How can I make the most contribution? And then college students. I've been teaching off and on for 25 years in college level. And I've never seen a generation so morally passionate, sometimes a little too morally passionate. But I'm sure if I were on the CU campus and I got to spend a couple of days with you, I would go at least a little cheered up about this country and about this world. So thank you so much for your attention. And I look forward to talking with the Chancellor.
Thank you, David. And now, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask a few questions. Some of those will be from students, maybe some that you've met today. My first question, we recently on campus hosted Cornell West and Robbie George, and they spoke about, of course, the importance of civil discourse, as well as the importance of seeking truth and being thoughtful. And Robbie George commented that many young people are focused on rising up, status, and prestige, which are not necessarily bad, but he recommended that we should all question our values. And when we do, we'll find out that influence and wealth do not matter as much as family and faith, serving others, and living a life of integrity. And this made me think, of course, of your book, The Second Mountain. And you've been giving us advice, but if you could continue on the advice that you would give those listening on how to really find joy in life. And can you find that joy on your first mountain without the pain or discomfort of being in a valley?
Yeah. Well, I think, I tell my wife, she had her second mountain first. She was raised in a deeply spiritual way. And I think she's just a joyous person. Most of us need the valley to knock the ego. The ego is driving us forward. As for happiness, we learned a lot about happiness over the last 50 years. We've had a ton of happiness research. And income matters up to a point, up to about 80,000, and then it sort of tapers off. the thing that produces the most happiness, well, sex does, sex works, but it's having dinner with friends. Joining a group that meets just once a month, a reading group or discussion group, produces the same happiness gain as making another $150,000. So just join a group that meets once a month. Even over Zoom, I've done, it's been very meaningful. The activity that most detracts from happiness, the daily activity, it's commuting, because you're usually alone and you're usually anxious. And so have dinner, join a club, don't commute. The thing that's been useful to me is making the distinction between happiness and joy. And so happiness is when you feel big about yourself, you get an A, your team wins the Rose Bowl, something like that happens and you feel accomplishment, and that's fine. I'm all for happiness, but you feel big about yourself. Joy happens when you forget about yourself. And that happens when you're dancing with friends. That happens when you're a teacher and you're seeing your student achieve something they'd never achieved before. And it's joy is when you forget about yourself. And so my advice is sometimes shoot for happiness, but shoot for joy. Joy is better. And it's those moments when you're not thinking about yourself at all, that you're lost in your work, you're lost in your friendship, or you're so dedicated to your community that, it's not about you anymore.
Thank you. David, in an opinion piece that you put out last year, you referred to our nation's current challenges and as and I quote, a formative moment for a new generation, and supported the idea of national service programs. Can you elaborate on the value of these programs and how young people can help bring them about or shape them?
Yeah, I used to work with a guy named Mark Shields on the News Hour on PBS, and Mark served in the Marine Corps. And the thing you learn about anybody who's been a Marine is you learn that about them before anything else. That's the thing they're proudest of, in part because of the service to country that is required, in part because it's really challenging, in part, as Mark said, he grew up in South Boston. He said, I never met a Black person until I was taking orders from them in the Marine Corps. And so he got to meet people completely unlike himself. And so if we had a national service program, you'd have kids from Boulder meeting kids from Biloxi. You'd have kids from Berkeley meeting kids from Boston. You'd have people from all over the country intermingling. And then they would get in the habit of thinking about neighborhood. One of the ways you could do national service is you can volunteer for any nonprofit you want. It doesn't have to be a big bureaucracy. You just go, and for every year, you get a year of tuition. And so, there's an organization in our Weave network called Thread. And Thread surrounds Baltimore students with 4 people they call volunteers, 8 more they call grandparents, and then 12 more. And so there's this dense network of volunteers surrounding the kids and driving them to school, making them lunch, taking them on trips, basically being an extended family. And Thread has an atmosphere that is life-changing for the adults. So they have a bunch of values. And some of the values are show all the way up. If you're in a meeting, be fully present and fully vulnerable in the meeting. Treat your attention like an on-off switch, not a dimmer. So you're either totally there or totally not there. Every voice counts. Every voice in the room has to have their voice heard. Treat relationships as wealth. And so to be in that culture and to be with people who are completely unlike yourself, you might be an affluent kid from Vail or Aspen or Denver or Aurora, and you're suddenly with really poor African-American, white, Latino kids. Believe me, that's life-changing. The one sure way to change your life is spend a year in some place completely unfamiliar to you. That will change your life. Study abroad or go. I was in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, poor rural area in Appalachia. You go there from where I come from in New York, changes your life. People are totally different. They have an attitude of if we attack each other, but if one of you outsiders attacks us, will kill you. Like, they have fierce loyalty in Appalachia, and it's life-changing to be around them.
Great. Now I'd like to ask a couple of questions came from our students. So Alyssa Radke from our Lead School of Business. And Alyssa would like to know the following. Social media has been a platform for many people and for many ideas. It's also been a platform used to divide people and to sow distrust and anger. How do you foresee social media playing a part in healing this divide? And do the individual platforms have a responsibility to lessen this divide?
Yeah, I've been a big critic of social media. Partly, if you're in the news business, they're driving so many of our papers out of business. So, but my basic critique is that since the smartphone came out, I think around 2012, the rise in teenage suicide is up 54% or so. And that's especially true with teenage girls. And every college I go to, the mental health facilities have been expanded, but they're overwhelmed. There's something going on with mental health. And so to me, that was a problem with social media, because A, you were competing against everybody else's highlight reel. B, you're in an atmosphere of opinion everywhere. There's judgment everywhere of you, but understanding nowhere. C, we evolved to have deep communication with maybe 140 people. Having shallow communication with thousands of people is deeply emotionally unsatisfying. And so I've been a critic. That criticism has been allayed a little for a couple reasons. One, I think we're learning to use it better. So I have a friend named Andy Crouch who, before he looks at a screen in the morning, he goes outside and looks at the sky. And he has Sabbaths, screen Sabbaths. And I've had to do that, or it shoots my attention span. And so we're learning to use it. And then one of the things that has proven, maybe my views are not correct, is that we have high polarization, high depression with a lot of social media. But in Denmark and in Japan and in Korea, they have less polarization and lower mental health problems with social media. So social media is the problem. Why is it only hitting America? And so my view of the toxic mixture of hyper-individualistic culture and social media is the problem. But I feel like we're learning to use it. And just the final thing on that, I was telling the students earlier today, I was in a conversation with a group of people who run Facebook groups. And these are communities. It's like African women in Germany they want to share their experience with other African women. And so they create a group. And there's young parents have groups, people who love tropical fish have groups. And what's striking to me is they did a survey, and in 11 out of the 13 countries they surveyed, more people said their most meaningful community is online than said it was in person. More people said their most meaningful community was online than said they were close to their family. And so people are finding ways. Maybe you join a group to talk about tropical fish, but humans are humans. They start telling stories about each other. When they go through hard times, they help each other out. And so my hope is that we're learning ways to deepen relationship in community. And it's not like we're going to get rid of online. Our life, every community is going to be online and offline. And so we just have to find ways to use it.
Great, thank you. So Brian Murthy is one of our students who's pursuing a degree in aerospace, aeronautical, and astronautical engineering. And he's part of our engineering leadership program. And he has a two-part question for you. Personally, what made you want to start a social project to combat hyper-individualism? And what does an ideal society look like to you?
That's a good question. I did it because I wasn't alive, obviously, in World War II. But on the day Pearl Harbor was bombed, George H.W. Bush, former president, was walking across college, and he walked into the recruiting office. He became the youngest flyer in the Navy. And that happened all the time during Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor was bombed. People stopped what they were doing and realized, I've got to do something extra. And so when we're in a crisis like we've been in, where people don't believe in truth, they don't believe in each other, where people are storming the Capitol, and you get so much anger. It seemed to me like a silent Pearl Harbor, that we're all called to do something a little extra. And it's super easy for me to sit on a laptop and write articles. But to go out into New Orleans, to go to Chicago and meet a guy named Charles Perry, who was served a lot of time in prison, and he now gives out his cell phone to gang members. He says, if you're in trouble, call me. And so his phone is ringing 24/7. He leads a life of just service, of self for others. And to be around those people and to support them in any way I can with the platform I have, it just has been much more fulfilling. And I started it because of a social crisis. And I think we're all, regardless of our age, we're called upon to do something extra at a time like this.
So another one of our engineering students, Caitlin Ponder, who's in our engineering leadership program, has the following question. How do you juggle your passion for writing in college with your major related interest and pressures? And what tips do you have for students who feel like they have to compromise practicing their passions for academic reasons?
Yeah, so when we got married, my wife thought we were going to have like long leisurely breakfasts where we'd talk, but I don't talk until I've written 1,000 words. And so I get up and I go straight to my study and I work from wherever, 7 to noon. And so the more creative the endeavor, the more disciplined the regime has to be. And so if you're doing writing or painting or engineering, you've got to have a rigid schedule. I'm going to do this from 7 to 12, 7 to 12, 7 to 12. Toni Morrison had a regime where she would go to a hotel room every morning, and there were only 4 or 5 things in the hotel room: a chair, a table, a typewriter, a Bible, and a bottle of brandy. And she would write 7 to 12. There was a writer named John Cheever who got up in his apartment in New York City, put on his one suit, took the elevator down to the basement where he had a study. He would take off his suit. He would write in his underwear till noon, put on the suit, get back in the elevator and make himself lunch. That was his routine. And so I'm a big believer in routines. And I'll say one other thing to the students, which I would always tell my students, and I'm not sure any of them followed me, is that writing, and when you're writing papers, it's about traffic management. It's about organization. So the way I write is I have thoughts, or I take notes as I'm reading, and I write them on Post-it notes. And I put the Post-it notes after I'm done with them on piles in the floor. And each pile is a paragraph in my story. And so to me, writing is not typing in a laptop. It's crawling around the floor, organizing my piles. And then I pick up a pile, I write the paragraph, I throw the paper out, I pick up the next pile and write the paragraph. So I tell my students, by the time you sit down at the laptop, your paper should be 80% done because you've organized it. And I'm not sure they listen because a lot of the papers I read like start off here and then they go here and then they go here. But I think everybody who's really good at any craft, they're obsessed with the process. And they really think hard about that process, how they do that thing. And I think that's as true for engineering or for administration or as it is for writing. It's the little tricks of knowing, so much of life is skill. It's having a skill. I now come to think morality is a skill. It's knowing how to have a conversation. Like there's a skill to that. Like a lot of us, when we're in conversation, pretend someone is talking to you and pretend it's your arm. He starts talking, and right about here, we stop listening because we're thinking of our response. But the skill of listening is listening all the way to the fingertips, and then maybe allowing a pause. The skill of, like Robbie George and Cornel West, the skill of debating is not restating your point. It's exploring the disagreement under the disagreement. Why? It's not interesting that you agree. What's interesting is why do you disagree? Or if you're having a disagreement with somebody, keep what they call the gem statement in the center. The gem statement is what we agree on. So if 2 brothers and sisters are debating one of their parents' healthcare and they're disagreeing, they return to the gem statement, which is, we both want what's best for dad. And so these are skills, and you learn them gradually or through life or by reading them or by talking to wise people.
So we've been talking about, our students, and I want to shift now to our faculty. And do you have any advice for our university faculty and our staff on how we can undertake the project of character formation when moral relativism seems so pervasive in higher education?
The thing I worry about higher ed is we become research universities, and that rewards specialization. And as a friend of mine once said, it makes asking the big questions of life seem inappropriate because we focus on our little academic niche and we only talk about that. As a professor friend of mine says, I've been in 1,000 hiring committee meetings. I've never had one where we said, does this person know how to teach character? We don't know anything about character. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's wrong for a couple of reasons. One, what a teacher really teaches is himself. That I don't remember a lot of what my teachers taught me, but I remember who they were. So there's a saying, I wrote in a column how hard it is to teach leadership and character in a classroom. And a veterinarian in Oregon wrote to me and said, never forget that what a wise person says is the least of that which they give. What gets communicated is their manner of being and their small gestures. Never forget the message is the person. I always remember that the message is the person. So we teach who we are. The second thing teachers can do is hold up exemplars. Hold up somebody who's really great. So at least if students fail, it won't be because they have an inadequate ideal. A Greek teacher in ancient times said, I make excellent things pleasurable for children. And so I wrote a book called The Road to Character, and it holds up like Dorothy Day, Dwight Eisenhower, really people who are pathetic at age 20, but amazing at 70. And the final bit of what stuff I've learned in the classroom, there was a moment when I talked about the dark time in my life. And I told my students, I only was at New Haven once a week, and I only stayed one night. And so I'd have my office, and I don't recommend this for the chancellor, but I would have my office in a bar between 9:30 and 1 in the morning. That was office hours. And like 7 to 10 students would come and we'd sit around and talk, and we never got anything academic accomplished, but we had a good time. And I told my students in class that day, I'm going through some personal issues. A friend is coming to help me. And so I'm gonna have to cancel office hours. And that night, of my 25 students in the seminar, I'd say 19 wrote to me an email and said, just want you to know, I'm thinking of you, I'm praying for you. And that little comment I made changed the whole tenor of the classroom for that whole term. Because I wasn't Professor Brooks. I was just another schmo trying to get through life. And so it was the stepping off out of the professor role and just showing a little hint of humanity. That I'm just like you guys. And I learned that about that little, you don't want to go too far, but a little hint of vulnerability from the faculty would be a good thing.
A little bit more humanity and vulnerability. I agree with you 100%. You've spoken and written about our current state of hyper-individualism. And I agree that this seems to be a major factor in the current state of America. And in past generations, we had civic organizations like the American Legion, the VFW, the Rotary, the Elks, which had really large memberships and played a major part in our community as far as social bonds and philanthropy goes. Are there 21st century replacements that young people should either join or create or support like we had as we were growing up?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot. When you look at the social indicators in America for the last 100 years, it's basically a big bell curve. You start in 1890, we had very individualistic society, a lot of prejudice, a lot of inequality, a lot of polarization, a lot of corruption. And then we slowly got better. And inequality went down, polarization went down, racial progress was made, things got better. And then around 1965, we shifted from a culture of we back to a culture of me. And over the last 60 years, all those social indicators have gone down. And one of the things they did in 1890 was they had a civic renaissance. Within like 10 years, they built the Boys and Girls Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Settlement House movement, the environmental movement, the NAACP, the unions. They built these civic organizations, Kiwanis, Rotary Club. And as you mentioned, I think there was a time in the 1920s when 1/3 of American men were in something like the Rotary Club or the Kiwanis Club or the Elks Lodge. And those withered. And I think it's up to this generation to build things, to build organizations. We just need a revolution of social entrepreneurship. And it's nice to have relationships, but institutions last. And so when you build an institution, it goes down through decades. And you walk into an institution like the Marine Corps, maybe like CU, and you're formed by it. You come out differently. It leaves a mark on you. I have visited a few times an organization in Salt Lake City called the Other Side Academy. And the Other Side Academy takes men and women who've been in prison over 25 years, and it turns them into movers. They're moving furniture. And their slogan is, we used to take things out your window, but now we take it out the door. And what they do is they not only do movers, they all live together in homes, and they have intense culture of moral improvement and integrity, what they call 200% accountability. And so at night, after moving during the day, somebody's furniture, they come back and they have something called games, and they sit around the room. And if somebody checked out a woman, they say, we don't do that. That's not who we are. And they call each other to account in this very loud and brutal way. These big 6'5" guys with tattoos all over their faces, screaming at each other. But it's a kind of culture that demands integrity, and people go through it and they come out changed. And if you want to know if your organization is a thick organization that changes people, you can ask them, do we all know the purpose here? Are there rituals and liturgies where we celebrate what the purpose of this organization is? Is there joy in the house? Is it particular? Is it unafraid to be very distinct? Where I went to school, the University of Chicago was not everybody's cup of tea, but was not afraid to be distinct. And it changed me. And for those who are in college, I feel more grateful to my college now, a couple decades out, than I did the day I left. I did not realize how college had planted seeds in me that were going to change my life and give me resources 25 and 30 years later. So we need young people to build those new Elks Lodges, because otherwise we won't have the institutions to have a healthy society.
That's right. We've been talking about leaders and leadership, but what are the obligations of followers or partners? It's always a two-way street. It's not just a one-way.
Yeah. Well, the key thing is the attitude toward institutions and what the purpose that you're serving when you're a little peon in a big institution. And we used to think of institutions as formative. We would go into a company, or we'd go into a college, or we'd go into anything, and we would accept its standards of excellence. I'm going to live up to the code of what it means to be a doctor. I'm going to try to become what the institution admires. But now we don't see institutions as formative. We see them as performative, stages on which I can perform. And so I see this most acutely in politics, where when I first started covering the US Senate, people just wanted to serve the institution of the Senate, its rules, its rituals, its practice of formality and compromise. But now they join the Senate because they want to be on TV. And so it's the stage on which they perform their splendid selves. And that's sometimes true in the media. We don't serve our newspaper. We just want to build our personal brand. And so having reverence for institutions makes them trustworthy. And people have reverence for institutions that are forming trustworthy people. And so I think when we denuded character formation from institutions, then we made them less admirable, and people just said, screw it, I'm going to use them, but it's not going to be really form me.
So David, if we could just have a couple more questions, mainly about the state of our nation, and talking about moral leadership and is there a lack of moral leadership in this country? And if so, how do we get it back?
Yeah, when I first got my column, I was given a good piece of advice, which was talk to 3 politicians every day. And I don't always do that, but I've spent a lot of my life around political elites in Washington. And it's taught me a few things. One, most of them have no respect for personal space. They're like super social people, and they stand too close to you and they pat your head and stuff like this. Joe Biden is very much like this. He's like, they're touchy people. Got him into trouble. The second thing I learned is that no conspiracy could ever be true, because I've been around the ruling class in this country, and they're not competent enough to pull off something and then hide it. So I now doubt almost all conspiracies, because our leaders are just not that smart. But the third thing is I've come to see them as good people stuck in a bad system. And I think the quality of the members of Congress, especially the Senate, it's as good as it's ever been. There are relatively few scoundrels. There are a lot of people who sort of hate their jobs. They're very bored in their jobs. They have to do a lot of fundraising. They feel they can't fully be honest and keep their job. And so I think the people are good. It's the incentive structures that are just terrible. And they're driven by fear of getting primaried. And even the very conservative ones and the very liberal ones, they think I've got to be on the extreme or I might lose my job. And so what we need is people who are courageous enough to risk their jobs and to think there's life. If I'm not a senator, there's lots of good things to do. But they have to get over that fear.
And finally, how does, you mentioned President Biden, but how does President Biden unify the country? What advice would you be giving him?
Yeah, I think he's having trouble because people are not used to compromise. There hasn't been really much compromise in the last 20 years, so they don't have the skills of compromise. And people are so mad at each other. And frankly, Democrats are so frankly disgusted with Republicans right now. They don't want to compromise. And I think he genuinely believes him. I've covered him for 25 years now, and I almost wrote a book about him back about 25 years ago. I wish I had. It would have been a good move. But I think he genuinely believes it. And I've heard him talk since being president. He has these phone interviews with us columnists. But it's going to take some time, because the January 6th events made the hatred so intense in Washington. And the sense that if you didn't support impeachment or did support impeachment, you're just morally objectionable. And it's going to be a long road back to that. And, I had a kid write to me, not a kid anymore, he's probably 30. And he's a Republican, and he wanted to dedicate his life to government and government service. But he doesn't like what the Republican Party has become. He doesn't like the whole game of politics right now. And he says, is this a stupid way to spend my life? And maybe I'll leave, I'll do something else. And for him, I don't know, but I would say if you're a young Republican, preserving your party is like a very noble thing right now. It's a party in crisis, I think. Politically, it's doing fine, but it's, in my view, not living up to what a party should do, which is politics. Politics is a noble thing where we solve our differences without fighting, and we do it by compromise and deal making. And when you've got a party that does not believe in deal making, and you don't have a party, you just got a TV movement, and you've just got a stage show. And so I would counsel young people to, if they go into government at any level, they'll find it tremendously rewarding. They'll find it is the crowded hour of their life where the decisions they make will feel like they have awesome consequences. And the people I know who've been in government really look back on their years as moments of intensity, of extreme busyness, but of deep satisfaction. So to people who are politically disillusioned, I would urge you to try it. I mean, it's really, people really find it. I have a friend who helped create something called PEPFAR, which is President Bush's anti-AIDS initiative in Africa. He can look back on his life and say, I was part of a program that saved tens of millions of lives. Where else are you going to get that kind of impact but in government?
Thank you, David. And David, this has been enlightening and fascinating. I certainly, and we all appreciate your time. And on behalf of our university community, I want to thank you for your compelling insights this evening. And I want to thank you, and thank everyone for joining us.
Thanks so much. Next time I'll do it from Boulder.
We would love that. We would look forward to that. And thanks for everyone joining us this evening. We bid you a good night. Stay safe, stay healthy, and take care of yourselves. Good night now.